Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Peter Wainwright, and I'm your facilitator for this evening's webinar on intercultural working. So we have two panelists with us tonight, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves a bit later on. We have Dr. Bjorn Klaas, who is an academic with the Open University Business School, and Jeremy Roebuck, who is a management consultant, and he'll tell us a little bit about his experience working cross-culturally with the GROW movement in Africa. So the objectives really are to share some of the insights that we gained from this day on the 23rd of June in London. But if you weren't there, this is ideal for you, because we're going to give you some insights about your leadership and management in intercultural settings. We're going to add in aspects of political astuteness and also add into that mix some very important learning about cross-cultural coaching. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll explain a bit about how we're going to be running this webinar. Okay, so you can see our agenda. So let's have a brief word of welcome from our two panelists. So Bjorn, would you like to just say briefly what your interest is in this particular topic?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Bjorn Klaas. I'm a central academic at the Open University in Milton Keynes. My interest in this is curiously not directly academically. I'm actually mainly an academic in operation management, but due to the fact that I've been traveling around, I've lived in several countries, and I basically lived the intercultural lifestyle myself. I picked this up and have made it now my academic interest. So I think later on I'll talk a little bit about what we did during the day. But for now, I just want to say hello to everybody and welcome to this webinar.
Thank you very much. And I noticed from your bio you speak 4 languages, which is probably more than many of us. But I'm sure our audience, especially those from overseas, probably many of them are in that category. Now we're going to go to Jeremy. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what the GROW movement is and your work with helping entrepreneurs in Africa, please?
Sure. Thanks, Peter. I'm Jeremy Roebuck. I'm an Open University graduate. I finished my MBA back in 2000, and these days I volunteer for a charity called GROW Movement. GROW Movement uses an international network of volunteer consultants, including quite a few OUBS alumni, to help alleviate poverty by advising and mentoring entrepreneurs in Africa via Skype and email. So I'm particularly interested in this subject because of the challenges we have working cross-culturally electronically.
Fantastic, and that idea of doing that cross-country, cross-cultural coaching and mentoring, I think is fascinating, and we'll hear more about that as we go through. In a minute, I'm going to ask Bjorn just to give us a flavour of the masterclass, but I'll just give you an idea of the structure of the evening. As you can see on screen, we've got video 1, 2, and 3. And we show a short video, 8 or 9 minutes. We then launch a poll where you have to choose one of 4 questions. We'll get the results of that, and then we'll have some discussion with our two panelists. But again, do feel free to pose questions in the chat. I'm sorry we don't have the technology to have a discussion with all the huge number of people, but do pose your question, and we'll pick up on many of those and ask the panel to comment. So we've got video 1, 2, and 3, and then we'll have a summary. So on the next slide, we've got, if we could have that, please, we've got an overview of the day. And I'll ask Bjorn just to give us a bit of a flavour of what that day in London was about on the 23rd of June.
Yes, sorry, I had to. Good. Well, it actually was a fascinating day with a really involved and participating audience. We had basically 3 speakers, one of which was myself, addressing 3 quite interesting parts of the intercultural leadership. So basically what we started out with, the presentation that I gave, is a presentation related to a course that we offer in the business school. And it basically asked basically the participants to look at how they react and respond to situations in which there is a cultural difference between themselves and where they work. So it could very well be that somebody goes abroad and has to adjust to the local customs and ways of doing things. And so we spent some time on looking into the aspects of what you can run into and how you can deal with it. After meet, we had a presentation about intercultural coaching by Phil Hayes. And Phil talked about how can you support those people who go abroad and will be faced, or foreigners who come here, or people in working in other kind of intercultural settings, how to deal with it. And so the first presentation was really about, we look at ourselves and how we respond in intercultural settings. And the second one by Phil was really looking in how can we support and help those who will be facing intercultural context and how to best deal with that. And then lastly, we had a presentation by Jean Hartley, a colleague of mine in the business school, who talked about political astuteness. And that was more of a slightly more research-driven presentation, which talked about political astuteness. And political astuteness is, for those who are not familiar with the term, is deploying political skills in situations involving diverse and sometimes competing interests and stakeholders in order to create sufficient alignment of interest and of consent in order to achieve outcomes. So it's what Jean talked about is not per se international intercultural settings, but just people from different backgrounds, people with different interests, people with different motivations that have to work together and achieve the best possible outcomes. And I think we had a very interesting discussion throughout the day of how best to deal with that.
Brilliant. Bjorn, thank you very much. Yes, it really was a really fascinating event. So I just noticed in the participant chat, if you've got tech problems, don't worry, that the tech team will be reading that. And I know some of you can't see the tech support button. So just bear with us, and we hope we'll get a solution. So now we're going to move on, to our first video, which is about 8 minutes. And you'll hear Bjorn giving us a number of ideas, and then we'll have a poll. So if I could ask the tech team to start the video, please.
So what is then culture? How do you define culture? And this is some attempt to make some theory out of it. The stuff that we go by. The stuff how we make sense of the world. The cultural norms, they prescribe and proscribe what is the right behavior and what is not the right behavior. How am I perceived? And do I make sense? What we should do and what we cannot do. So what are you going to do? How would you do it? You start talking. But there's too many situations in which you have no time to talk and to investigate. You have to make a decision on the spot. And you have to interpret your behavior. And you have to be aware that you're in a different context. You have to take into account what are the cultural values. What is good and what is beautiful, what is holy, what are the legitimate goals in life. Go by cultural symbols, by stories, by rituals, by observation. What is it they're doing? What is it what they're talking about? What keeps them busy? What do you talk about over coffee or tea? Culture is something very pervasive in society. It affects all aspects of life. And not all aspects are visible. Culture is about socialization. The process of learning the rules and behavioral patterns appropriate to one's society. Cultural learning. But still, it is a process of acculturation. The process of adjusting, adapting to a culture other than one's own. Commonly experienced by expatriate workers. It is their ability to fit in, to see and recognize and interpret and adjust and correct and use and maybe sometimes abuse a little bit in a respectful way. Right? So culture then is kind of like an iceberg. It's part of what you see, the cliches and the stereotypes that you go by. and a whole bunch that you can't see. This is the iceberg. There's a part that we can see, our cultural makeup that we are aware of, the humor that we make, the religion that we have, the etiquette that we do, the way we dance, courtship practice. And so even this doesn't help us a lot. Not to mention what is even deeper under this iceberg. All these components that make up who we are. So Hofstede, those who have done the MBA, have all heard about Hofstede, my fellow countryman, who looks at this cultural consequences, tries to classify them and somehow categorize them. And there is a measure about the difference between cooperation and competition. Whereas the Chinese or even the Japanese are very, very team-based. If you go to the US, it's very, very individualistic. And it defines our society. It defines on how we see each other, how we measure each other, how we interpret each other's behavior. What is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Let's try to do that. Let's try to classify it. There's the national culture, the dominant culture within the political boundaries of a nation state. Let's define the British. What are the British? That's the four nations. Some concept to me as a Dutch, from Holland, is something very difficult to me. Scots and Northern Irish and Welsh and English are. It's the United Kingdom. They are British. I don't see any difference. There is though. But somehow it is a way of classifying them by starting somewhere and some way of making sense of that world. And then there is business culture. Which sector are we in? Am I a civil servant? Am I a sole entrepreneur? Do I work for a big multinational? And what kind of sense can I make out of that? How can I find some reason to explain that I behave in this particular way? Facilitated or constrained by my environment, by the resources that I have available, or not. And then there's occupation and organizational culture. One organization is not the same as the other one. Pepsi is different from Coca-Cola. Mars is different from Hershey's. M&S is different from Sainsbury's or from Asda. They all have their own company culture, and they use it to their benefit. It's part of their business model. And then within those organizations, we start talking about the operations department or logistics, and we start talking about sales, and we start talking about marketing, and HR and finance. And again, we all have to work together somehow, despite talking different languages. So we have to start learning to navigate the seas of international business, or the seas of business. And let's forget about this excessive focus on the international aspect. And again, there are certain things that we can observe. How do you look like? How do you dress? Are you wearing a tie? Don't you wear a tie? Are you wearing a suit? Or are you wearing a pair of jeans? And what interpretation can I make out of that? Start talking and assessing. Get the conversation going. Trying to make sense. To learn a little bit more. To test, on one hand, what you see at the highest level. To validate that. And to find what you haven't observed. And then dig deeper. And start testing your assumptions. What did I think it was? What sense do I make afterwards? So we need to adopt this global perspective. What does it mean? It means somehow recognizing who we are. In our course, we have a whole chapter dedicated to presenting yourselves as the other. Putting yourself in the other person's shoes. And try to see how you look at yourself, how you behave. And how it could be interpreted or misinterpreted. And getting this understanding of the meaning of others' actions. Or my action interpreted by others. Perspective on one's own ways. How do I talk? How do I act? How do I communicate? How do I respond? So that's the matter of having different attitudes. This ethnocentric attitude. The parochialistic belief that the best work approaches and practices are those of my home country. We've tried them. They are the best way. And you should adopt them, whether you want or not. Or is it this polycentric attitude, the view that managers in the host countries know the best? Just accepting what is always there. Is that better? No, it's also not good. There needs, again, to be this conversation. There needs to be finding this common ground. What is the best of the both worlds? Maybe that's what this one is all about. The world-oriented view that focuses, uses the best approaches from people around the globe. Is this a universal solution? By no means. It's not a universal solution. Is it something that we should strive for? Not necessarily. Is it an approach that we should take? I think so. Will the result be the same everywhere? By no means. But we need to find what works for everybody. We shouldn't hold on to our own habits in an excessive way. Because it affects us everywhere. It affects us on the way we work, on the way we manage our businesses, on the way we manage our customers, and the way we manage our suppliers, the way we manage the supply chain, the way we get forward and seek these achievements.
This is Peter Wainwright, your facilitator speaking. If you've just joined us, welcome. We've just finished our first video segment. Well, that was a fantastic set of insights about working across cultures. We've now got poll 1 on screen. I'm going to ask our tech team to, I'll read it through first, then launch the poll. So based on what you've heard and your experience, what's your priority for improving your intercultural competence? You can see it on the screen there. Is it A, to actually actively do more research into the cultures of the people I'm going to be working with? Is it B, maybe just to be more aware of my own behavior and how it's interpreted by those in those different cultures? Or C, is it to actively plan in more getting to know you time rather than going straight into technical stuff when we're forming working relationships across cultures? Or maybe D, is it about seeking out more experiences, just trying something and experimenting? So while you're giving your choices on that, I'll just ask for a couple of reflections from Jeremy. So, Jeremy, when you're working with colleagues in Africa, I mean, to what extent do you think the artifacts or the behaviours kind of may be misinterpreted, looking back at that iceberg model? Because often what you can see is above the waterline. So, or to what extent are you able to interpret what's happening underneath about the values?
It is very difficult, and we do have to continually dig down beyond what is shown on the surface. We're dealing with communication where somebody's talking in a second language, which adds complication. We're dealing electronically, through Skype, which doesn't work necessarily too well with Eastern Africa, and we're dealing cross-culturally. So all of those add enormous complexity, so it's always important not to take anything for granted and to check understanding and continue to dig until we have reached both parties are understanding each other.
I like that idea of checking understanding in the sense of a kind of a process and experimenting. Let's see what the poll results are telling us, and then I'll bring Bjorn in. So could our tech team please give us the poll results in a second? But while we're doing that, I'll just ask Bjorn. I mean, hang on, it's up here now. Right, so that's amazing. So 45% is about being more aware of your own behaviours. Bjorn, I just wondered, what do you think of these results? Do they surprising for you, or how would you interpret them? I know they've just popped up, but your view, please.
Well, it does kind of reflect the decisions that people express, or the arguments that people express for taking the elective when they do the course in the business school. And I think it makes sense because more and more people, whether they're prepared for it or not, are being exposed to intercultural settings, and there's quite often very little to hold on to. It's really a matter of you're being thrown in the deep end. Expected to survive in the best possible way, and I think just creating an awareness does help people, and if we look back to the day, what we're talking there, it's not rocket science. It's just, how do I deal with different situations, and how can I be made aware of what's going on and how it may be interpreted from the other side.
That's really interesting, that theme of awareness, and we'll be coming to that in the next video. I mean, Jeremy, can I ask, to what extent do you and your team actively kind of promote this, becoming more aware, i.e. this kind of looking at one's own culture rather than sort of learning about other people, as it were? Do you kind of, how do you go about that?
We don't assume that our consultants have much in terms of cross-cultural awareness when we start. We look for business experience and academic background and coaching experience. A lot of the cultural aspect is picked up by individuals on the job, but also by group chat amongst consultants, so sharing experiences and sharing insight. So I guess about half of what I know is stuff I've learned from working with clients, and half of what I know is from discussions with my peers.
Yeah, that's so it sounds like one needs to put quite a bit of effort into being aware of these skills. And just before we move on, very interesting that number D gets 22%. So quite a lot of you really put a value in terms of your own priority of seeking out new experiences. So that's really interesting. Maybe taking a risk because you don't quite know necessarily what's going to happen. Well, look, let's move on from poll number 1 and on to video 2, which is a segment from Phil Hayes about cross-cultural coaching.
Culture is a group construct. Coaching happens with individuals. So one of the traps that we might fall into is thinking that culture is everything. It's certainly a factor, and it's a very important factor, but it's not everything. Not all Germans are the same. Not all Dutch people are the same. And as soon as we get into that kind of what I call lazy stereotyping, then we're going to be in just as much trouble as if we don't even think about culture. So we do need to think about the whole individual, which makes it complex, but also fills it with potential, I'd argue. We've touched upon this already. Sometimes an organisational culture can completely overwhelm a national culture, and these are 3 examples where people from all sorts of different nationalities are engaged in these particular organisations, and they define themselves to a degree more by the organisation than by their own national culture, or at least significantly more than you might expect. Some other complicated factors: hundreds of millions of expat workers. And by the way, who defines who's an expat and who's a migrant in this equation? That's a rather interesting question, I think. But there are lots of people moving around the world, working in different cultures. Generation Y is creating an absolutely distinct, or broadly distinct, I should say, rather than absolutely, a broadly distinct culture of its own. Some people will argue, I've heard it said, that you can be 25 in Johannesburg and have more in common culturally with somebody who's 25 in Tokyo than with your parents, largely due to social media and the way that they look at the world. Lots of student migration, media influences we just sort of touched upon, and the fact is we do know a lot more about cultures thanks to things like TV. We do. Just picking up on Generation Y, they're a very interconnected culture because of social media, but they also have some very different attitudes, and there's not much question in most people around Generation Y about should we embrace culture. It's kind of like, it's a given. It's a given. There are some pretty across the board fundamental assumptions of intercultural value. And there are some challenges for managers of Generation Y people too, particularly the idea that people want to be praised and recognised and fast-tracked. So where does this leave coaching? And you can read this for yourself, but I think it's this bit about reading the game, reading the whole individual in the context of their cultural influences, not assuming that they're made up of their cultural influences. They are people, they are individuals. So just one way of getting your head around what we might need to do as coaches is to ask ourselves this question: are we cultural critics or cultural learners? And a cultural critic is essentially somebody who will take a view that says one cultural view is right and the others compare badly against it, or the difference alone is a bad thing, as opposed to a cultural learner whose attitude and worldview is one of saying we need to be consistently and incrementally learning more and more about different cultural influences and learning. There are some things which are really in common between coaching and intercultural learning, I would say, and these are three of them. If you take yourself to be a cultural learner, you do have, in general, a belief in people's resourcefulness, which is an underpinning attitude for coaching, as those of you who've experienced it will know. You need to believe that people can make changes. There's an underpinning respect of positive regard for people. And there's a commitment to developing trusting, open and positive relationships. So this is where I think coaching and intercultural learning have really good ground and really good sort of traction together. So here we go. This I think is where we've got some very, very practical things which we can do as coaches, whether we're coaching directly or we are training people to coach. And it's based on these 5 universal learning requirements. So the assumption here is that there are 5 ways in which we all need to learn. But we can go about it in lots of different ways, dependent on our cultural preference. So number 1, we all need insight. We all need, if we're going to make change for ourselves, we're going to learn about ourselves in a coaching context, we need some personal insight. Feedback is one great way of getting it, but as we've just discussed, it's not for everybody. Feedback doesn't work in the same way for everybody. So you might want to try some different things. Get people to do some self-reflection, for example, rather than just give them some feedback. Give them some role models to learn from. Engage with them at a theoretical level, because some people like that, as opposed to just being told, just being given feedback. Even creative techniques can help people draw insight about themselves. I say even creative techniques. You might get from that a sort of bias of my own. I find it a bit uncomfortable. But nonetheless, I know that a lot of people work very creatively in coaching, and creative techniques can help people to learn about themselves. So insight, several approaches to helping people gain insight. People need motivation to change and develop, otherwise they won't do it. So this is universal, but when we coach and train coaches, we can help them to create that insight by understanding the different cultural influences on how they might want to express and acquire motivation. So for example, if we just compare cultures which are individualistic with cultures that are collective, we might think about our approach to how they might want to gain motivation. Are they trying to achieve for themselves, for example, or are they trying to achieve for the benefit of their communities? What is the motivation? Capability. Everybody needs some skills and knowledge to learn, and culturally we do this in very different ways. So some capabilities you'll see are regarded as important virtually everywhere. And some things really vary. Risk-taking is an interesting one. In some cultures, it's great to say, let's say you're coaching somebody, it might be great in an American culture, for example, to say, go out and try it. Go out and take this back to your team, whole new way of working, whole new set of behaviours, and there's a possibility or probability they might even embrace that because they like risk-taking. And risk-taking is culturally supported. Better to ask for forgiveness than permission, in a risk-taking culture. Other cultures, not at all happy with risk-taking, and if you make a mistake, you can be punished for it. So you may have to bear that in mind when you're helping people to think about being effective. Everybody needs to be able to practice their learning in the real world to see what effect their learning has had and to check if they're doing the right things. Risk-taking will come into this. Some people will have to have real assurance that there is a real theoretical underpinning to what they're being asked to take risks about before they'll take a risk. And they might risk, because of that, paradoxically, paralysis by analysis. You need to do too much theory and not enough action. You may have experienced some of this. And the fifth requirement is accountability. If you want people to be learning, they have to be accountable to something or someone. It might be to themselves, or it might be to their organisation, or it might be to their culture or their society. But without that sense of accountability, why they're going to be effective in their learning. Just a point here that depending on culture, some accountability is made very clear. You know, in some cultures you have a contract, don't you? And it's a very thick contract, and everything is laid out very specifically. And in other cultures, that can be seen as an insult. Don't you trust me? Might be the question. I've shaken your hand. Don't you trust me? You know. So we need to be aware of that dimension. But we still need, however we approach it, to be in coaching, to be encouraging and helping people to identify accountability.
Well, that was a really interesting set of observations about the real challenges of coaching across cultural settings. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of, before the poll's out, I'm going to read that through in a second, but Steve made a point here, and I'll throw this question to our panel. Is the question of managing UK and offshore teams fundamentally any different from those involved in managing in-house as opposed to consultant and contractor teams? There may be different dimensions to cross-cultural changes, but in doing so, are we not overlooking the importance of managers being aware of cultural issues in whatever context they may occur? So Bjorn, what's your thoughts on that particular point, please?
Oh, absolutely right. I mean, I think there is a lot of emphasis on the differences in national culture simply because there's most written on it, and it's easiest kind of to compare. But I think the differences between the difference in functions or the difference in organizations, they are equally important. This is just that if you want to start thinking about it, whilst you can roughly define what is a Dutch culture versus an English culture, it's very difficult to say what's an operations management culture versus a marketing culture, or a difference in organization. What's the difference between Coca-Cola and PepsiCo? So it just becomes a little more difficult to handle. But absolutely, those cultural differences are absolutely there. And I think there was another question a bit later on whether, for example, religion is part of the culture. Absolutely right, it is. But even religion as a subset of the culture, there's just so many different interpretations of it that sometimes in presentations like this, it's just very hard to handle. But yeah, the comments that were made in that matter, because there was another comment somewhere from Coyote in was it in not sure where he calls in from, but there's national subcultures, and it's absolutely right. Culture takes so many, it's present at so many levels, and yes, we have to become aware of that. It's sometimes just very difficult to define, what is the culture versus what is the other culture.
Bjorn, thanks very much. Now let's go to poll 2, and I'll ask our team to put the questions up. But here we have a challenge or a question for you. For you to get better at coaching or helping others in these different cultures, do you need to, A, be more aware of the different approaches to risk-taking? That was a point that Phil mentioned in the video a couple of times. Maybe is it reflecting more deeply my own cultural influences on how I personally learn, and that might affect my coaching style? Or is it being aware of opportunities to put learning into practice, how they may vary across different cultures? Or D, is it understanding how motivation is influenced by different factors in different cultures? There's some quite tricky questions there, so if you'd like to select one of those, please. And while we're waiting for the poll results to come out, I'll just I'll just ask Jeremy. Jeremy, do you find in your work that people do like to learn in different ways, and that maybe the entrepreneurs that you're mentoring have a different way of approaching their learning, let's say, to perhaps those based in UK?
I wouldn't say different, because I think people have different learning styles in the UK. So I wouldn't treat our clients in Africa any different than I would treat a diverse group of people here. Everyone has different learning styles. I don't see that particularly as through the lens of culture.
That's really interesting, but maybe even that concept of learning styles has a cultural aspect to it. So let me just check if we've got our poll results. if I can ask the tech team to display them on the screen, then we'll have a bit of a debate about that. Interesting questions here. D sees the all-important bigger picture, the many different variables. Yes, there are many, many factors there. Wow, let's have a look. So D is getting 58%, followed by C being aware of the opportunities. And A and B is the smallest. So, Bjorn, could you comment on that? Tell us about your interpretation of how maybe motivation to learn can be influenced by these different factors and different cultures.
Well, I think it's sort of this process of sense making that we are placed in context in which there are different cultures are placed, and things happen different from what we expected, and we try to make sense of it. And if I'm put in a setting with somebody from a different country or from a different function or from any kind of different culture, that's the first thing that I start looking at. And a good training, a good awareness about what drives these cultural differences makes us understand what's happening better, without having to fall back into all kind of stereotypes and draw the wrong conclusions based on that. So it's all this part of the sense-making process, and the more you think about it, and the more you actually look at what drives different individuals to take a different approach to the solution of problems, or to making comments or asking questions, and the better you can respond to it, and the more effective you will ultimately be as a professional and as a person, for that matter.
That's it. Yeah, it's very interesting, this theme that's coming out about a process of finding things out, and how culture and learning seem to be linked. So we'll move on to the next video in a second, but do keep your questions flowing. There are lots of them, difficult to keep up with them all, and thanks to Bjorn for tackling the earlier ones. Interesting one here from Michelle. It says, at a recent networking event, this was raised as a common issue, as managers are not given any guidance on how they may need to adapt their styles. So everyone has to figure it out through trial and error. So that maybe goes to the academic learning aspect, why people do an MBA and other courses, because we want to have not just trial and error, but have theory underpinning it. Okay, looking at the time, we need to move on to video 3, which is a clip from Professor Jean Hartley talking about political astuteness, which can apply across cultures, and our poll will be looking at political astuteness in that cultural setting. So if our tech team could roll with the video, that would be fantastic.
So what do we mean by political astuteness? As Bjorn said, it's a phrase that isn't necessarily widely used, but we often have a range of words to try to describe this rather nebulous thing that we can sometimes feel in organizations, that some people are quite astute or savvy, and other people perhaps more politically naive or politically clumsy, or even politically malicious. So a range of different words. I really want to focus on the idea that it's both big P and small p politics. So it's not just about working with government, local government, central government, and so on, although that may be, for some jobs, that may be important. But it's also the small p politics, working with cliques and factions in your organization, maybe having to work with suppliers who've got different outlooks or different goals, maybe working in strategic alliances and so on. And here are the key components as our research has shown, first in the UK and then reinforced from our work in Australia and New Zealand. So first, and I'm going to show you 5 dimensions. So first of all, personal skill, being self-aware. It's the foundation of any kind of leadership, but it's particularly important if you want to be politically astute. Also having self-control, so knowing when to be emotional and when to be very controlled, when to hide your feelings, and when to let them show. It also involves curiosity about other people. And I think that links in very well with what Phil was saying about culture. Actually being really interested about what makes people tick and why they're different from you. So rather than judging them, be thinking about where are they coming from? What's it like to be in their shoes? And the other element of personal skills is around being proactive. So this is about setting the agenda rather than waiting for the agenda to happen to you. Now, that's not always necessarily action. Sometimes you might be thinking about the agenda and thinking that you want to force an opponent to make the first move. But that's still being proactive because you've thought it out rather than be reactive. Secondly, interpersonal skills. So making other people feel valued, building relationships with a wide range of different people, encouraging people to talk to you about their interests and their plans and so on. But it's not just soft skills, this is also tough skills as well. So being comfortable with conflict, being able to deliver tough messages to people, being able to negotiate is also quite important. So you know when to move between being soft and being tough, or sometimes being both at the same time, as some negotiators would recommend. Thirdly, and I think this links in very much to what something Phil said about reading the game. So we've called it reading people and situations. So this is about when you get people together to try to get something done, you're really thinking not just about the surface agenda, but what's below the surface as well. What do people really want from this situation? They may not be revealing everything. What kind of power have people got? Do you know enough about the people that you work with to know whether what they promise is deliverable or not? It's also about being able to know when you're a threat to other people because you've recognized and understood what their interests or their goals are. So this is partly analytical and it's partly intuitive. That's what managers tell us. So a number of managers will think before they go into a difficult meeting or a negotiating meeting, really thinking through what are the different interests around the table on my own side as well as on the other side. Or as you bring together suppliers or partners, what is it they really want to get out of this? They may be telling you one thing, but there may be some other things under the surface. So that's really important and right at the heart. But having analysed things, this is, if you like, where we move from awareness into astuteness, you might say. If you have to take action, can you build alignment and alliances? Can you reach out to partners to build a coalition, for example? Do you know who to include and who to exclude? Can you look for partners beyond the immediate and obvious ones and build alliances with people that perhaps haven't been thought of up till now? It's also about being able to build alliance across competing interests. And it's very interesting because a lot of work, not all of it, but some of the work on collaboration often talks about try and find the win-win. And that assumes that people have common interests, but they often don't. They may have some common purposes, but they may also have some differences in interest as well. Then finally, strategic direction and scanning. Up till now, these four have been thinking about other people and what are their interests, what it's like to be in their shoes. But strategic direction and scanning brings you back to yourself and think, what's my purposes? What am I trying to achieve for the company, for the organization? Some people get so caught up in reading other people that they actually lose a sense of what their own purpose is. So it's about having a sense of long-term direction, knowing when the time is right to be able to really push on those agendas, and other times where you may have to tread water for a period because the time isn't right. People are too preoccupied or they're pursuing other goals or whatever. So really reading that. It's also about strategic scanning, which is about really trying to interpret the small things that may be happening, not just on the horizon, but also over the horizon as well. What might be happening in your trade or your sector that's heralding that the changes, some kinds of changes are coming, that you may need to anticipate and start thinking about now? What might your partners or your potential coalition be talking about that indicates that they might be moving in a different direction? When you're talking with cliques and people who belong to different cliques and factions in the organization, what are they talking about, or what are they getting preoccupied about that signals that in 6 months' time they might put something surprising on the table? So it's that sense of having an antenna and scanning, that political antenna part of things.
Well, we heard some very interesting insights from Jean Hartley there about her model of political astuteness skills, which, as you noticed, wasn't presented in the context of a particular culture. So that's what we now want to explore. So there's a comment here I just want to pick up on, perhaps Bjorn or Jeremy, from Gavin. It says, are these elements that Jean's talking about less applicable in a commercial organization where sales and profit are the drivers of success? So I'm thinking about the comment of knowing when to include and exclude. Including too many often leads to a lack of focus. So Bjorn first, can I ask you, what's your angle on that, about how this applies, do you think, in a commercial organization? Hello?
If Bjorn's not there, shall I?
Okay,
sorry about that. I had my microphone on mute. So what I was saying, I think they're actually, I would almost argue that they're at least as important in commercial organizations, if not more important, for the simple fact that the consequences of not doing it right in a commercial organization will probably be much more immediate than they would be in public organizations.
That's a really astute comment. And Jeremy, what's your thoughts on that? Because people often like to. It's a common thing that people see the world in that sort of for-profit, not-for-profit type of divide. What's your feeling on this?
Exactly the same as Bjorn's. That it's equally important in a for-profit organisation as elsewhere.
Okay. Well, let's. We've got poll 3 up there. So this is about what do you need to do to improve your political skills in an intercultural context. Is it your ability to influence people that links to the sort of interpersonal or personal skills in different cultures? Is it about improving your knowledge of what influences power in different cultures? Could be very subtle differences. Is it about understanding, C, how conflicts are resolved in different cultures? Or is it D, recognizing that different cultures have different approaches to collaboration? So which one of these do you think you need to improve? So if you could make your vote now, and hopefully the results will be ready. But while they're coming up, I'm just going to ask Jeremy. Jeremy, when you, in the work that you're doing with the Grow movement, how do you know when a conflict is arising? I mean, do you develop this awareness that other people may have different ideas of what a conflict is and how it's resolved compared to, let's say, people in the UK? I mean, because if you don't recognise a conflict, that can derail things. So I wonder what your experience of that is.
Sure. Happily, it's not a frequent issue for us. We are giving a free service in terms of free advice and mentoring, and it rarely provokes conflict. We do have occasions where relationships will break down for various reasons, and it's the job of our country managers. In each of the countries we operate, we have an employed country manager who keeps an eye on all of the projects running under his or her control, and intervenes to either try and put it back on the rails or perhaps assign another volunteer.
Yeah. Okay, so really that highlights the importance of having a country manager or somebody in that situation who kind of makes sense of the ground.
And this person will be culturally far more aware than the volunteer in most towns.
Sorry, what was that, Jeremy?
The country manager will be far more aware of the local implications.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Got that. Yeah. So could we have the poll results, please? Quite an interesting even spread. So I'm going to ask Bjorn. Do you have any thoughts on that? It's a lot of information to take in, isn't it? A poll result. I have no idea how this is going to pan out, what the results are. So what's your thoughts on this, please?
I'm not surprised by the outcome, because if you really look well at the questions, A said, develop my ability to influence people from different cultures. Then B said, improve my knowledge of what influences power of different cultures. These things are, one follows the other, or they're highly related. And actually all these questions, they are so related. It all comes down to better I understand the habits and the customs of the people who I deal with, the more influence I can exert, the more power I can impose, and the more benefits I will extract from it. So, to be honest, if I look at this question now, to ask the audience where really the emphasis should be, the emphasis should be on all four of them, because they are related. They're almost one and the same thing.
That's really interesting.
It's reflected in the answers as well.
Yeah, that the model that Jean was talking about means that as managers and leaders, we need to be working on all those different levels, all those different in a kind of integrated way. I'm going to ask a very interesting question here from Joanna. She wants to ask if something can be delivered in a yes/no closed type of conversation. Can you discuss the detailed plan by asking open questions that don't have a yes or no? Maybe that's a political skill. So that's in response to How do you? I mean, does that mean that in different cultures that we need to avoid this kind of yes/no type of thing that we might be used to in our own particular home culture? We might be more able to say yes or no. When we're dealing with other cultures, there might be a variety of different shades in between.
I think from a Grow Movement perspective, we've quite early learned that somebody saying yes to us may not mean yes. It may be that because the European guy has said X, Y, Z, I must agree. It's a disappointing feature, perhaps, that we see this. But when a client says yes, they will do something, we do have to not just accept that, but talk some more.
That's really interesting, and again links back to earlier discussions we had, doesn't it, about understanding the culture. So it's like the politics and culture. You can't really. Political skills and culture can't really separate them. We're going to move on to a summary in a minute, but a very interesting comment from Mark there. I don't know, Bjorn, if you got a comment. Mark Hootson says, how do you get a positive result when dealing with a culture that will never say that something can't be delivered? Maybe that's a facade. I mean, have you encountered that, Bjorn?
Do you have an answer to what you could do? No, I don't. For the simple fact is it's very, very context specific, and my only answer is that if you start working in a culture like that, is prepare. Ultimately, that's what courses that we teach in the business school all come down to. Is that the better you're aware of things and the better you see how the different options that you could do to deal with it in advance, before you're presented with the issue, the better you will be able to deal with the issue. Will you solve any kind of problem or issue that you make out? No, you won't. But I think the trick here is to come as prepared as possible. And during the day when we talk to people, it became very, very clear that, look, if I would be sent from Milton Keynes to Myanmar, the Open University will prepare me. Yet if they will send me to Spain or they will send me to France, they won't prepare me, and they just throw me in the deep. And I think that is what a lot of companies do with a lot of managers. Most of the time, they are well trained to do the technical part of the job, but to deal with the cultural issues and the way how they perform in those different cultures is just assumed that they know that. And this is a good example of that. If you present to this, what would you do? To be honest, I don't have the answer to that.
Yes. Well, it's a great advert for education, and indeed the MBA elective, leading and managing in intercultural contexts, which can now be studied as a standalone elective. Before I ask, I'll be asking Bjorn to sort of give his summary of the overall session in a second. But I just want to ask Jeremy for some concluding thoughts from the questions and what how you've what your experience of the polls has been. Have you got any thoughts? How has your view of working interculturally perhaps changed?
I think the polls have been fascinating. The comments have been coming so fast that I need to go back to study some of them, because you start to read them and then they disappear because so many people have been commenting, which is fantastic. I think it's fantastic that this webinar has taken place to raise awareness and to talk about some of the things that the OU can and does do. Happy to have been here, and I've learned from it in the same way that I learn from volunteering with Grow Movements every day.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Isn't it wonderful to hear that panelists are learning? Very rarely do you hear that on political shows, because people think they know all the answers. So it's wonderful to hear that. I've got a couple of slides at the end which are sort of telling you about where you can post information and get hold of it. But Bjorn, I'll give you the final word, if you may, please, as the OUBS Central Academic, in looking at this business perspective webinar and this program. Some concluding thoughts from you, please.
Well, I think what Jeremy just said made a lot of sense. What we can do in a session like this is we can't answer all the questions, and we can't tell you how it works. So we can only raise some awareness. And I think what we've done through the 3 different presentations that we saw in this session. The first presentation really is how you as a person can handle and can become aware of the cultural issues that may or may not be there. If you look at Phil's session, it's how can you help other people to become more aware and conscious of it. And then what Jean does is actually ultimately what it comes down to is, once I'm aware, how can I use it to my benefit? And how can I actually exploit the cultural differences and get results? And what we hope to do, both with the day in London a couple of weeks back and with this session, is just raise that awareness. Because just what I said a couple of moments before, the cultural aspect in doing business is often assumed to be known. And I think that is one of the biggest oversights that we do in international trade, is that we look all on the details of the contract and the details of the partners and the financial aspect, but we forget to overlook this, and we just throw people in a context which can pose some really interesting problems. And this session hopefully will create a bit of extra awareness that it would pay off for organizations and for people personally to go in well prepared, to see what they can expect, and also to think about how they would respond to it.
Bjorn, thank you very much indeed for your comments and for your participation today and also in the event in London. And Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for your input. Very, very different perspectives. So we've had a nice 2 very different perspectives. The next couple of slides, just a bit about what's happening next. So if we could have the next one, please, and how you can kind of get in touch. Hopefully it's going to come on screen now. Yeah, and those of you who've been to these seminars before will know about this. Various different LinkedIn groups. You're going to get an email asking you for your feedback. And on the final slide here, just to emphasise that this is, those of you who are alumni are part of this 90,000 strong network of alumni around the world from the business school. And there's information there about the new online coaching course that Phil and his company have been working with the Open University Business School with executive education. And there's Jeremy's website of the Grow Movement that he's involved with. So, folks, we're out of time now, so thank you very much indeed for all of you for attending. Thank you to our participants, and hope to see you at a future event. So, good night from me. Bye-bye.